Good afternoon. I'll call this meeting of the House Housing, Finance, and Policy Committee to order. I'll note a quorum is present. Vice Chair Agbaji, have you had a chance to review the minutes?
Yes, so moved, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All right, meeting minutes approved. Members, today we're going to have, I kind of like to call it speed dating with housing experts, giving us a array of their knowledge across the continuum of housing. And so we'll hear from a number of folks from homelessness all the way up to home ownership. I'd ask, our first presentation will be about 15 minutes. I'll ask testifiers to try to, for the subsequent, keep it to around 6 to 7 minutes. And for members, if you have a really burning question, let me know. But otherwise, let's try to get through our experts. And if we have time at the end, we'll go to questions. And so up first, we have a presentation by Kathy Tenbrook with the Minnesota Interagency Council on Homelessness. Ms. Tenbrook, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, Chair Howard. Wonderful to be here. Great to see you again. Thank you, members. I am absolutely delighted to have the opportunity to introduce myself to those of you who I don't know, introduce the work of the Interagency Council on Homelessness, and of course talk about some of the most critical issues facing people experiencing homelessness across the state. So thank you again for the opportunity. I'm Kathy Tenbrook. I am an assistant commissioner at Minnesota Housing. I'm the executive director of our state's Interagency Council on Homelessness. And I will tell you a little bit more about that in just a moment. Do you want me to pause?
No, I just heard you had 8 views.
Oh, thank you. No, I think we're up. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And so I did want to say right before I start that we intentionally gave you a lot of information. It's in your packets. This PowerPoint would be too long to go through every detail of it. So I will stay at a pretty high level, but just an invite to at any moment reach out to our office for any questions or more conversation on any piece of this that you hear today. Great. So for those of you who are less familiar, the Minnesota Interagency Council on Homelessness is a cabinet-level body. It's led by our Lieutenant Governor, and it is co-chaired by our Housing Commissioner, Jennifer Ho, and Human Services Commissioner, Jody Harpstead. But it has the commissioners of all of the agencies you see on the screen here that attend the council meetings that really help drive the policy and budgeting decisions across these agencies as it relates to housing stability and homelessness. And this cabinet level body was formed with the recognition that no one state agency is responsible for preventing and ending homelessness, but rather each of these agencies has a really important role to play, whether it is preventing people from exiting public systems like corrections and foster care into homelessness, helping identify homeless and highly mobile students across the state, addressing the critical needs of domestic violence survivors, increasing incomes, supporting people in recovery, preventing overdoses, and helping to access needed health care, or creating the kinds of housing opportunities that will work for all Minnesotans, men, women, children, and youth, regardless of their circumstances across the state. So the role of the council, as I mentioned, is to help direct policy and budgeting decisions, work with partners all across the state of Minnesota. Since its inception in 2013 as a cabinet-level body, it has created these very clear action plans for work on homelessness that have been implemented. Our last one ended in 2020, and we were about to launch into a whole planning process. And as you can imagine, we got a little paused in our planning on this due to COVID. Our team, our interagency team, was really point on a lot of the work related to COVID and people facing homelessness across the state. But we are now in the midst of the planning for our next strategic plan, which I will tell you a little bit more about in just one moment. But first, I want to kind of focus you on what we mean when we talk about ending homelessness. You probably hear that phrase and wonder, what does that really look like? What are you trying to achieve? And when we talk about ending homelessness, we don't mean that no one ever again in the state of Minnesota, or we don't think it means that no one will ever have some kind of a housing crisis. But we do believe that we can do a better job as a system all across the state to prevent those housing crises from ending up in homelessness. And when that is not possible, we want to make sure that that instance of homelessness is very brief, that it's rare because we have a lot of housing opportunities for people, and that it doesn't happen again. So we use this little animated slide to show that we're preventing new incidents with programs like eviction prevention and our family homeless prevention assistance. We're creating more housing outcomes that makes homelessness rare. We're trying to quickly identify when a family or individual is experiencing homelessness so we can quickly resolve that homelessness for them. And then the key part here is so people don't cycle through our systems is to make sure there are adequate services and supports so people don't keep falling into homelessness and keeping them stably housed. So I think one of our best examples of this definition is our work on veteran homelessness. We now have 85 of our 87 counties in the state of Minnesota have effectively ended veteran homelessness. So they have created systems in their communities that do just this. They prevent veteran homelessness. They know who is experiencing homelessness and quickly connecting with them person by person, identifying what they need, getting them reconnected into housing, and then making sure they have the supports and services to sustain that housing. And that's what we want to do across the continuum of work and populations. I know you heard a lot about this yesterday, so I won't spend a lot of time here. You heard from Commissioner Ho, you heard from Ann Mavity from MHP. The reason we have the number of people experiencing homelessness in the state that we do is our housing crisis. The gap that we have, especially for renters at the lowest incomes, and I think this chart is yet another way to show that gap really significantly. So 177,000 households in Minnesota have incomes below 30% area median income, and we only have 119,000 units to meet that price point. So already there's a gap. And then among those that are available, many people with higher incomes utilize those opportunities as well. So the gap is the largest for the people who have the least amount of income in our state. This next slide, and I apologize, is a little hard to read. That big gap you see in this slide is COVID, and we didn't have the opportunity to do our point-in-time count in the same way that we do the other year. So it is blank. But imagine a little dotted line, if you will, to that final point on the right-hand side. The annual one-night point-in-time count is just one way we try to look at trends and measure how our work is going on homelessness in the state of Minnesota. This is something done all across the country. It is given to HUD, the Housing and Urban Development, every year nationally, and it is a minimum count. We don't think this is a perfect method by any means, but we do think that it's consistent enough that it gives us some good information about trend lines. And while it's difficult to read those lines, I think what I'll do is draw your attention to the right-hand side of this graph. And here you can see where we've had success and where we've had significant challenges. As you see overall, we have about 8,000 people who were identified in the last point in time count who were homeless on one night throughout Minnesota. And once again, that's a minimum count. But what we see is very uneven progress depending on populations. So where we've seen some pretty significant success has been in our work with families with children and homeless youth. We have made some and thanks to many of you in this room, some very intentional investments and strategic investments in that work to try to bring down those numbers. And our really talented providers across the state are doing great work with those dollars and making a difference. But I will also add that even with this success, for example, people in families with children, we still have over 7,000 homeless and highly mobile students in 77 of our 87 counties in school districts that are identified as homeless. And so that's over the course of, it's a little bit of a different definition than this point in time count, but we know that they are struggling to do their educational achievement while they don't have a safe and stable place to live. Same with the unaccompanied youth. We're delighted to see these numbers going in the right direction. It means we have some good tools. The Homeless Youth Act is a flexible, very, very effective tool that we utilize to serve homeless youth. But still far too many young people find themselves homeless. And we know this is a minimum count because youth in particular are difficult to identify. Lots of couch hopping, doubled and tripled up. And I also do think it's really important to point out that that progress depends on where you are in the state as well. On tribal nations, we have some data from our Minnesota Tribal Collaborative that youth homelessness is actually rising in tribal nations and not seeing the same kind of progress. So just keeping all of that in mind as we try to measure our success. I do once again want to point down to the veterans line here. It looks a little flat on this screen because with these smaller numbers and doing an annual count, it's a little hard to really use these numbers. Instead, we have a real-time data veterans registry, homeless veterans registry, where we work to identify every single veteran, understand their needs, what they're eligible for, and then get them connected to it. And that has been such a success in serving people better that we are looking at ways to do something similar for youth and seniors and others to make sure that they're getting what they need and is a person-centered response. This chart shows the impacts of racism and inequity, and this is always a really important chart and something that I'm always really blown away by every time I talk about it or look at it. I think there's often a thought that the disparities in poverty are similar to the disparities in homelessness. And what this chart is showing you is that among people in Minnesota who are living in poverty, there is absolutely disparities. This chart is showing you that you are 4 times more likely to be living in poverty if you're American Indian in Minnesota than white Minnesotans. And it's showing you that you're 3 times more likely to be in poverty if you're Black than a white Minnesotan. But if you go over to homelessness, 32 times more likely to be experiencing homelessness as American Indian than a white Minnesotan, and 12 times more likely if you're a Black. So very important to recognize the impact of racism and to focus on the undoing of those injustices. This chart is from our Wilder Research Survey, and once again, going really fast. I know you have all of this, so happy to dive deeper into any of it. This shows really the complexity for some of our folks. One of our biggest challenges in this work that you probably know well is that we've seen a rise in people who are sleeping outside, who have very complex health conditions, and it's one of the areas of work that we are really intensely focused on trying to improve. Part of the reason that it's challenging is that people have very complex health conditions that are overlapping, and this graph shows, chronic physical health conditions, serious mental illness, and substance use disorder among homeless adults. And so therefore, we need to design solutions and housing and programs that work for people that have that kind of complexity in their life. And we do that by working with them directly and understanding needs. This slide is just to draw your attention to the fact that we have a new Minnesota Center of Excellence on Public Health and Homelessness. I'm really proud that we were one of 3 places in the country selected for this. They're doing the first ever homeless mortality study. Then the data will be coming out very shortly, so I'll make sure that you all are able to see that as well. I think it'll be important information for the legislative session. And then I did just want to touch on the fact that I mentioned earlier, we are in the midst of redoing our strategic plan, and the vision of the Lieutenant Governor and the Interagency Council on Homelessness is to evolve our work into one that is focused on creating housing justice, racial justice, and health justice for people facing homelessness across the state. And we know that in order to do this, we needed to first understand what that meant. What are the definitions of justice for people facing homelessness? We hired 10 people with lived experience of homelessness to lead this work with us, to kind of go out to the community, have community conversations, have internal conversations with state leaders, and then synthesize that into definitions. They have done that. The council has committed to moving towards the definitions of justice that they've brought forward. And they are now in the process of working on bringing these results and the strategies that state agencies can take to achieve these results forward to the council in June. So we are going to have meetings in April and June to finalize this strategic plan. But I think what you'll see in this work going forward is a very intentional shift and focus to center people with lived experience of homelessness in the work, in the process of defining what is going to be the solution that works best for them. And I'm really excited about where this work is headed. And then I wanted to say that I don't know if some of you were at the rally today and heard the governor and lieutenant governor. They will be releasing the interagency housing stability budget soon in the coming days. And this work that we are doing together on the housing stability continuum, I know you heard Commissioner Ho talk about this yesterday, is really focused on everything from preventing and ending homelessness, creating a healthy rental market for low-income renters all across the state, and also closing the disparities in homeownership. And so it is covering that gamut. But we know that if we are going to truly transform what we are experiencing in the state of Minnesota around housing stability and really have this be a moment where we change the trajectory going forward, these 4 buckets you see on the right are really the areas where we see are the most important to increase investments and strategy and focusing. So increasing the amount of housing and shelter that we have, addressing the affordability of housing, increasing the accessibility of housing and shelter, and ensuring, once again, that we have adequate and reliable ongoing supports and services so that people can be successful. Wanting you to know how to get in touch with our office, lots of information on our website there at the top about all of the work on the justice-oriented plan, certainly a lot of work that has been done during COVID, if that's something interesting, and ways for anybody, your constituents and anyone who wants to be engaged in this work going forward. We'd love to connect with them. And then also here is my small but mighty team. And once again, open invitation for anybody to reach out to talk to us at any moment about anything you've heard today, anything more you want to know about. And I'm also very happy to take a few questions if there's time.
Thank you, Ms. Tenbrook. And I would really encourage members to reach out to the interagency. This ability for us to kind of get out of our silos and tackle this from a holistic approach makes a ton of sense. And so I would underscore for members to follow up. I did see Representative Norris. Do you have a question?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. And Ms. Tenbrook, thanks for this great information. I wanted to go back to the number on slide 6, the 123% increase in people experiencing chronic homelessness. That's an alarming number, especially in light of the previous slide where we talked about wanting homelessness to be, rare, brief, and non-recurring. So I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about what are some of the drivers that are causing that big spike.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question. Yes, I think all of these numbers that you see in red are interconnected. So the increase in individuals, the increase in people who are chronically homeless, and by definition that means you're homeless for a very long period of time or repeatedly becoming homeless, and then people who are staying outside. Those are often, interconnected. And this is a trend that's happening nationwide as well. And I think at its core, it is that as we have housing that does become available, it is typically not housing that is going to meet the needs of people who do have more intense complexities in their life, complex health conditions. And so housing becomes further and further out of reach for that population. So these are folks who tend to have the very least income and the most complex health conditions. And the combination of those two things makes housing even more out of reach for them. So when you have a housing market that's tight, in other words, they're the least likely to be able to get into that housing and sustain that housing without the right kinds of supports.
Representative Norris? Representative Kozlowski?
Thank you, Chair and Assistant Commissioner. Thank you so much for this overview and for being here. One of the things that I haven't quite heard yet on this committee, and sure it's coming, but if you would be able to speak to, diving into the folks who are overrepresented in homelessness, and one of those populations would be the LGBTQ community, especially Black and brown, trans women, and non-binary folks. Would you be able to speak to the engagement that you're doing on the task force, as well as what are the real challenges that you see? As we know, there's so many reasons. How come we see our youth in experiencing homelessness and then discrimination in the workplace and so many other factors that really accelerate and exacerbate? So if you'd be able to just touch on that briefly and just the areas of gaps, but also the opportunities that you see the legislature could really play a key role in making that better for our LGBTQ folks.
Ms. Tenbrook.
Thank you very much, Representative. Chair Howard. Yes, it's such a big question, and I would love to spend a lot more time talking to you about it, actually. And I want to answer it as best I can right now. In the work on justice, the gender justice has come up as a really important piece of our whole effort, as well as LGBTQ issues. Some of our consultants with lived experience of homelessness do come from that community and really are intense about making sure that what we talk about, how we frame it, the language we use, and who we engage in this work is well represented. For homeless youth in particular, one of the things I wanted to talk about is the solutions and the things that we need for LGBTQ youth, all youth really, but LGBTQ youth in particular, is that we really do need, when we invest in youth programming, to ensure that it is youth-serving agencies that are really, I think, they're the experts and in youth development and LGBTQ youth work specifically, rather than having young people be served by adult systems that often aren't as well equipped to serve with that kind of very specific expertise and support. And so I think as we think about investments that will serve young people, and we think of young people as under 25, so they're in the adult category, but that can also be served by youth-serving agencies. And we have some of the best youth-serving agencies, I think, in the nation, and specifically youth-serving agencies that do a really intentional, focused job on serving LGBTQ youth in particular. And so I think making sure where we're investing and how we're investing and being flexible in that kind of investment that will serve those kids best. Kind of like we've talked about with the person-by-person effort, we need to talk to each individual youth. I think young people, really truly like anybody experiencing homelessness, but I think it's very, very clear that young people's experiences are so different from each other. And so what the result and solution for one young person is going to look extremely different than another young person. And so I think the more we do that person by person, I think we will meet the needs regardless of somebody's identification more effectively, because they will be telling us what they need and what will work for them rather than the other way around. So I think that's a really important piece of our justice strategies and how we frame what happens next in all of that work.
Thank you, Ms. Tenbruck. And again, encourage members to reach out on an ongoing basis. Next, we have up Sue Watlove Phillips from the Metropolitan Interfaith Council on Affordable Housing. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and committee members. Sue Watlove Phillips, Executive Director of MICA, the Metropolitan Interfaith Council on Affordable Housing, and the past president of the National Coalition for the Homeless. I want to introduce Gary Kwong, who's our board president for MICA, and just tell you just a little bit about MICA. And just want to say that I've had the opportunity in working on housing and homelessness for over 55 years to help to write a lot of the legislation that we've passed in the last 40 years in regards to housing and homelessness here, both in the state and at the national level. MICA started in 1988 as our faith community had been serving people experiencing homelessness. That began this growth of new homelessness over the last 5 decades. In the late 70s and early 80s, it became very clear by 88 is that many of us knew that the system and the structure needed to be changed. It wasn't just addressing the immediate needs, but we had a significant structural issue. And so MICA formed, and we believe that we want to ensure that everyone without exception has a safe, decent, accessible home, whether it's rental or home ownership, that's affordable for them. We have almost 2,000 folks that are involved across the metro area. They're involved in doing prevention, outreach, shelter, transitional housing, supportive housing, permanent housing, building, as well as rehabbing, as well as doing home ownership. We want to be a welcoming community where everyone is welcomed in our community, and want to make sure that we are loving and treating others the way that we want to be treated. So this is the brochure that's in your packet. And what I really do want to spend most of my time on today is to talk about this homelessness that we've had growing for 5 decades here in the United States. This is the longest episode of homelessness since the colonial days. And so I want you to understand as we are moving forward and looking at solutions, how we got here, and then some of the things that we need to do. So many of us that have been involved since the 60s and 70s warned that if we did not address homelessness as it was developing in the early 80s, is that we would continue to see massive growth in homelessness. I experienced homelessness as a teenager about 50 years ago, and that happened when I got hurt in some sports at the University of Minnesota. I worked a part-time job loading trucks at UPS at night and competed in sports and was in school, got hurt in sports and was not able to continue my job and was not able to continue to rent my place after a couple months because I didn't have any more money in savings. And so the situation is that it can happen to any one of us. And currently in the United States, 78% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. Over half Americans live 1 to 3 paychecks away from not being able to make their mortgage or their rental payment. And over half of us will at some point have a mental health and chemical health issue in our life. That's true for me, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a while. If you have money, you can have housing, no matter what kind of issues you have, basically. If you don't have enough money, it's going to be hard to get into housing. But if you don't have much money and you have a lot of issues, it's going to be almost impossible. And you are very much heading towards the sinkhole of homelessness that we talked about today. We, as a society, as a civilized society, have a moral responsibility to each other. It's not just about us, just not about me, that we have caused these structural changes in our society. When I rented first at the University of Minnesota, I paid $125 for my efficiency. I worked a part-time job. I paid for my housing, my car, my schooling, and could do all that. That was less than 50 years ago. It's not true in our society. You cannot work most part-time jobs and be able to do that. So what are the 10 primary reasons that we got into this mess? One is we've had the limited moral outcry, and that we don't love and treat others the way that we want to be treated. And so we need to listen to people that are experiencing homelessness in the housing crisis, and they need to be at every decision-making table all the time, not just for as advisors, but really at the table helping design the responses that meet the diversity of needs of folks that are experiencing homelessness. And we need to pay people for being at the table and using their expertise. Being a baby boomer, it was in the 60s that we were the do-your-own-thing generation, and the me and the greed really began there, and this whole idea of selfies and taking care of just me became a real major issue. Not as when I grew up, when John Kennedy, as our president, said, don't ask what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. We treat housing as a commodity, which means that it's not a basic need, that we create our wealth off of that. And so here in Minnesota, we spend 3 to 4 times as much money on those of us that are homeowners. So my dad was a World War II vet. When he came out of the service after going to college on the GI Bill, he bought a new home that was built in Fridley, paid $12,000 for that in 1955. I was a young child. I moved in there. They sold it to me in the early 1990s for $90,000. It's now worth over $325,000. This is how we develop wealth and generational wealth within our culture. But we exclude a large number of folks from being able to get into that wealth through discrimination and not providing opportunities for people. So we have some of the worst disparities in the country. And how we do this is how we subsidize ourselves that are homeowners is through the tax expenditure budget, through write-off of our taxes, mortgage interest, the homestead credit, capital gains, and as you heard from Commissioner Ho yesterday, we spend $1.2 billion every year on mortgage revenue bonds to help people get to become homeowners, and then a bunch of other dollars that we spend too. We have the lack and no enforcement, basically, of a lot of our civil rights and fair housing. Our wages, Social Security, unemployment, and public assistance do not pay a livable income. So all the public assistance programs that we fund here in Minnesota don't provide enough people to afford housing unless they have some type of a rental subsidy. We demolished a lot of housing. So during urban renewal in the 60s and 70s, we destroyed a lot of the old residential hotels. And so basically what happened is that people became homeless. They didn't have housing. And we got rid of a lot of the tax codes to be able to have our mom and pop landlords have housing. We expanded credit. We disinvested opportunities for people with limited incomes. And we have had a lot of scams and issues in regards to housing and somewhat in the homeless industry, which you can read a little bit more about. Now we have a system that if you want to rent housing, you have to do a criminal credit and rental check. And that can keep you from getting into housing. And so I want to say to you that I could not get into rental housing here in the Twin Cities right now. because from 2002 to 2012, I struggled with alcoholism. And during that time, I had different periods of sobriety, and I was able to, do okay and keep my job. And in 2011, as my dad was dying, I was doing exercises, trying to make sure that I would stay sober, got hurt, and I was prescribed a non-narcotic medication that ended up being an opioid. I had a stroke and a seizure, threw my alcoholism into a full rage, ended up having an accident. I have a felony on my record, and was on probation for 6 years. So it can happen, but I didn't become homeless because I had a home. I owned a home, and I had resources. And I think that's the thing that we need to remember. So if I could just have one quick more moment, just to tell a quick little story. It's kind of based off of a story in my faith tradition called the Samaritan, Good Samaritan. So this person falls into this hole, gets into this hole, and he's calling out. He says, help me get out of this hole. So this person walks by and he says, well, that was pretty stupid to get into that hole. He said, help me. Well, I don't know if we have a program to do that. We might have to get some data. I think we have to do a coordinated entry on you and get some information on you. And if we have resources, we might be able to help you. And the guy walks off and says, I'll try to send somebody back. The next person walks by, and the person says, help me. And the person looks over and says, I am so sorry. Our congregation just gave away all the money that we had brought in for prevention and for food and for helping people with presents and things like that. But I'll see if we have some money to help you out. The next person comes by and he says, help me. And he jumped in the hole. And the person looks at him and goes, why did you jump in the hole? We're both in the hole now. And the person said, because I've been here before and I know some ways to get out. So what we are asking you is we have this hole called homelessness. We have entrusted with you to be our elected officials and to have the $17+ billion to fill that hole. We need you to do it now. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Watley Phillips. And Representative Johnson had a quick question.
Chair Howard, Ms. Watley, I want to thank you for being here today. You brought up one of the major struggles we have with homelessness. And that's the fact that everybody's requiring background checks, and why is that? I have a perfect story to tell you why. My wife used to work in property management in the county department, and a lot of times she had to go deal with stuff, so she knew a lot what was going on there. They had a tenant that let her boyfriend move in. Boyfriend not on the lease. Management company didn't know about that he was even there. The tenant gave him a key. He raped a 12-year-old girl on that property. He was a level 2 sex offender that the property management did not know was there. That property management company had to pay out $1 million lawsuit because that person was on the property. You told the best reason why we need, one of the reasons for homelessness, and that is a desperate need for tort reform. I've talked about it for years. We need to do major tort reform so some of these people can actually get into housing, because of the way people are getting sued for everything. Property management companies, their insurance agencies, who have to pay these bills, and because these lawsuits drive up the cost of rent, are causing the problem. And that's something that we need to deal with, that we've dealt with for a long time. And this body and a lot of the lawyers fight against it time after time after time after time. And it's time to get them in their place.
Mrs. Watley Phillips, thank you for coming and testifying. Up next, we have the Minnesota Coalition for the Homeless and Rhonda Otteson joining us. Ms. Otteson, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. It's nice to see so many members today. Like Chair Howard said, I'm Rhonda Otteson, Executive Director of the Minnesota Coalition for the Homeless, and we are the only statewide advocacy organization working to end homelessness in Minnesota. With over 70 member organizations from across the state, We work to generate policies, community support, and local resources needed to end homelessness in Minnesota. We're also a partner in the Homes for All Coalition, joining over 270 organizations across the state that advocate the full continuum of housing, from shelter to permanent homes that we need here in Minnesota to meet the various needs of our great state. To start my testimony, I want to be really direct in saying that we have a homelessness and housing crisis here in Minnesota. We have record numbers of people experiencing homelessness, and rents continue to rise at rates that far outpace the income of many Minnesotans. I'm going to share a few statistics about homelessness and housing instability from the Wilder Homeless Study and also the statewide homelessness management information system. On any given night in Minnesota, there are 20,000 people, children, adults, seniors experiencing homelessness in Minnesota, and over the course of the year, it's 50,000 people who experience homelessness. For people on the coordinated entry waiting list to get into housing, the average wait time is 12 months to get into a permanent home. While individuals and families wait for a safe and dignified home, shelter is a life-saving resource, and almost every county and reservation in Minnesota has identified a need for more shelter spaces. Unsheltered homelessness across the state increased 62% between 2015 and 2018, and Kathy Tenbrook, of course, shared some additional statistics for you to look at through the point-in-time count. A third of people experiencing homelessness are employed, and children and youth comprise about half of the homeless population. And 4% of Minnesotans identify as LGBTQ and represent 11% of people experiencing homelessness here. So that overrepresentation is definitely there in the LGBTQ population as well. And finally, seniors are one of the fastest growing segments of the homeless population, which grew by 25% between 2015 and 2018. So folks who are aging in our state are also facing homelessness at greater rates. Homelessness is a racial equity issue. Kathy shared a bunch of great information about this. BIPOC folks experience homelessness at much greater rates. Black Minnesotans are about 5% of the population, but are 36% of people experiencing homelessness. The Native or Indigenous population, 1% of our state population, but 18% of people experiencing homelessness. And finally, overall, people of color are 10 times more likely to experience homelessness than white folks. So culturally responsive shelter services and housing models that are really needed to advance housing stability here in Minnesota on both reservations and in counties across the state. At MCH, we work with a lot of different organizations and advocates. It's really important for people with lived experience of homelessness to shape, identify solutions, and we do that at the Minnesota Coalition for the Homeless. Folks are, with lived experience, rank and select our key priorities for our policy agenda and play key roles in our advocacy. Leaders with deep expertise of homelessness are really essential partners in this work. Over the past 3 years, the MCH has worked closely with our community leaders to gather detailed information, in particular about shelter. We have a really large gap in the available shelter here in Minnesota. There is a handout called the 2023 Statewide Emergency Shelter Capital Needs Assessment, and I just want to point out a couple key items from that. There are 86 projects that are ready, either to be new projects or that need rehab or can be acquired at almost $200 million. And these combined, they would create or preserve 3,500 spaces for people to come into shelter. There are a wide range of shelter projects that are really needed. Culturally responsive shelter models are really important. Domestic violence shelters, youth shelters, gender affirming shelters, and others as noted at the bottom of the handout. And as you look at the geographic distribution of the shelter projects, and I myself, coming from greater Minnesota, I live in Wilmer, every area of the state needs shelter. And you can see that broken down by region and by tribal nations. The state of Minnesota has never had a program to invest in shelter. So that is why you see this big and deep need for investments in shelter capital to preserve the shelters we do have and expand the resources we have for folks. Along with those capital resources, general operating support to provide those shelters with the staffing and resources they need to work with folks as they seek a permanent home is really important as well. We know that there's no one single one-size-fits-all solution to our housing and homelessness crisis here in Minnesota. There's street outreach, youth programming, various types of shelter models, transitional housing, supportive housing models, rental assistance programs, and also the creation and preservation of homes here in Minnesota that are really needed. We need safe, dignified, accessible homes for people, whether they're rental or homeownership opportunities. So as we move through session, you are going to hear us with a lot of different bills coming to the legislature. Some will be in this committee. We look forward to partnering with you to find solutions. And I think the great part about this is that we know that there are tried and true solutions, things that really work in our housing space, providers that are doing really great work. It's just simply been a lack of investment of resources to meet the scale of the problem here that we have in Minnesota. So if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Otteson. So our first three testifiers were sharing on the homelessness continuum, and our next few will talk about multi-housing, and then we'll get to home ownership. So up next, we have Dr. Johnson, Dr. Eric Anthony Johnson with Aeon.
Thank you, Chair Howard and committee members. My name is Dr. Eric Anthony Johnson. I am the president, CEO of Aeon. Aeon is a nonprofit developer. We own and operate about 6,000 units across the Twin Cities. In that collection of properties, we do a combination of tax credits and NOAA acquisitions. And what I want to speak to the committee today is specifically about the NOAA space. The definition of NOAA basically is multifamily properties constructed in the late 1960s, early 70s, early 80s. You will find these multifamily developments in pretty much every sector of Minnesota. And given the age and nature of these properties, the term naturally occurring affordable housing really suggests that definition is affordable because of the age, right? So, but what I really want to talk about is this continuum of dealing with this affordable housing challenge, which I know you guys have heard and you continue to hear, is a multi-pronged strategy I believe we need to take, leading from the state down to the local level. And by way of experience, I recently returned from Dallas, where I was the Chief of Economic Development, Housing, Real Estate Construction for Dallas, previously the Community Development Director for the City of Bloomington, where we actually on the ground did some great work in the space of NOAA in terms of preserving. What's important to note is that Aeon is probably the forerunner in terms of taking on the challenges in the NOAA space. And there's reasons for that. We are the entity that is first called to save units in terms of loss, in terms of whether it's investors coming in because construction costs are high. It's easy to purchase a NOAA property and add some paint on the property versus building new construction. But it's also an opportunity to acquire property, to preserve it. So when we talk about NOAA, there's a couple of things I think is important. It's going to be difficult to build our way out of this thing. It's important to note that if we can preserve what we have while tackling the full spectrum of homelessness, affordability around home ownership, affordability in the multi-family sector, because it's all key to the economic competitiveness of the state. But I think it's important to know that to do this requires a couple of things, Mr. Chair and committee members. One, the ability to move with speed when NOAA acquisitions emerge. And let me just talk quickly about that. Number one, an investor shows up, and you probably heard stories about Richfield, potentially in Bloomington, where an investor shows up out of New York, Chicago, or whatever, is going to say, hey, we're going to buy this property, we're going to close in 30 days. So the community is up against speed. You don't want to really sort of mess around with the market, but what you want to be able to do is have the ability to move fast enough to acquire the property. So that's number one in the NOAA space in order to preserve. Number two is just your traditional NOAA sort of sitting there, and there's an opportunity where you're not in a race against time to buy those properties. But the need is this, committee members and Mr. Chair, it's about having not just acquisition dollars, because I think the dominant conversation around NOAA has been about acquisitions. But truth of the matter, it's about having access to acquisition dollars and dollars to rehab the property, right? And I say that because having worked at the local level, understand city councils, understand community, you want to have properties that you can be proud of. You want to have properties where the residents can live in a higher standard of living, and that requires money to do it, right? So many of you may know we own Huntington in Brooklyn Park, second largest multifamily complex in the state of Minnesota. And if you really have some time, you want to talk about the challenges of NOAA, I can spend some time with you. But I'm really here to say that the continuum is a broad one. It's a combination of dealing with the homelessness issue, dealing with affordable rentals as part of either market rate developments or just traditional tax credit projects, and through affordable home ownership. But it's important to know in the NOAA space, it's important to preserve what we have. And I don't have to say to you guys or preach to the choir in terms of the number of units we are losing on a yearly basis related to affordable housing. In the NOAA space is important. So my ask today, and as we continue this conversation, is to really give some consideration to a source that will allow for two things: acquisition with speed and support for rehabilitation. And specifically, when it comes to rehabilitation, you're dealing with aging properties that will have capital improvement needs and deferred maintenance needs. And there's a reason why investors will scoop them up quickly, because it's easier, again, to buy those properties quickly, throw some paint on them, raise the rents, and you basically only wait. So I will conclude with that, and I appreciate it. Chair Howard and committee, and I'll take any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Johnson. Any questions? Thank you. Up next, we have Paul Williams with Project for Pride in Living. I guess Mr. Williams. There we go.
This is real. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Greetings, committee members. My name is Paul Williams. I'm the president and CEO of Project for Pride in Living, a large multi-service organization that does housing development and management, as well as employment and training work across the Twin Cities. For over 50 years now, PPL has worked to build the hope, assets, and self-reliance of individuals and families who have lower incomes by providing transformative affordable housing and career readiness services. Today, I've been asked to share that work with you, and I hope to provide a level set for committee members on the challenges the people in Minnesota communities face, as well as the headwinds for us in community development. At PPL, we own and manage close to 1,600 units of affordable housing in the core cities of St. Paul and Minneapolis, as well as several western suburbs, western suburban areas of the Twin Cities. Close to 3,500 folks live with us every night, nearly half of them children. Half of our units are considered supportive housing, serving households making 30% of area median income or less. That typically means they're making less than $20,000 a year and are likely coming out of the region's shelter system. Our latest development, as just one example, Bloom Lake Flats over in South Minneapolis at Lake and Bloomington, includes 42 units of supportive housing for individuals and families where at least one member of the household is living with HIV and has recently experienced housing instability. Our metric of success is 24 months. If we can help those households maintain that housing for 2 years, they are exponentially more likely to increase their income, to expand their education, to grow their career skill sets, and to move up. And equally important, their kids are exponentially more likely to prosper. That's because housing is not a roof, it's a foundation. Without housing, there is no job, there is no health care, there is no education, there is no child care. I'm proud to say that 97% of our residents meet that 24-month threshold. Sadly, however, as you've heard from many of our speakers, we don't have enough foundations to build up all of those lives. Simply put, we have failed to produce enough units of housing to keep pace with growth and demand. That leads to skyrocketing rents. At the same time, we also know that housing is an income issue, as wages haven't risen adequately to meet those rent levels. The impact of those two realities have hit communities of color, BIPOC communities, particularly hard. We see that every day at PPL, where close to 90% of our residents are from those BIPOC communities. And we see that every day across this state, where BIPOC communities are experiencing evictions at higher levels, as you've heard, juggling choices between rent and food, foregoing health care, and struggling to obtain and sustain employment. This issue has everything to do with equity, I think, as several folks have already said. For more than a decade, Minnesota has not been able to keep up with the demands for more housing to meet Minnesota's growing population, and certainly not enough to meet the needs of those struggling with housing costs and instability. As demand for housing, for affordable housing solutions grow, so too does our work at PPL. We're grateful for your work and for the work of the committee and the state to increase our housing inventory through production and financial tools in the past. Housing infrastructure bonds have been a critical resource that is essential to make new homes a reality in our communities. The present investment, however, hasn't kept up with demand, especially as efforts to grow our region and make it competitive also have taken effect. Minnesota is suffering a crisis of available housing, especially housing available to those folks making 50% of the median income or less. Recent estimates suggest Minnesota will need to increase housing production by over 10,000 units per year. Approximately half of that will need to be affordable to address current demand. Without that increase in production, more and more households will struggle to maintain or gain housing stability. Those struggles can be prevented with the commitment to more housing infrastructure bonds that seed these types of housing developments. We have shovel-ready projects, as you've heard, across this state that can begin to meet that challenge. In addition to producing more housing, it's becoming increasingly difficult to continue to operate affordable housing in the current economic environment. Monthly cash flow margins at our properties are designed to be narrow in order to ensure that dollars are used to provide high-quality housing while keeping rents affordable. However, recent growth in key cost drivers, most notably in our property taxes, insurance, utility, security expenses, are making it increasingly difficult to operate affordable housing in a way that preserves the dignity of our residents and ensures the ability to continue to provide quality, affordable housing for our communities across the region. We are increasingly seeing situations where we work for years to get a new development funded and constructed, only to open the doors with monthly losses right off the bat. That's been a growing problem for a number of years. The last 3 years of the pandemic, however, have markedly accelerated those losses. Operating expense relief through adjustments to the 4D property tax increase, property tax classification has been a top priority for our organization over the last several legislative sessions. And finally, passing that legislation this year would go a long way toward shoring up our ability to not only operate that housing effectively, but also to develop new housing. Increasingly, I will hear my board say, that doesn't pencil out. We can't do that. And in many cases, the nonprofit developers, in fact, are the only entities that are able to produce the very housing that we need at the lowest income levels. So we're caught not only in a production and supply problem, but we're caught also with an operating problem. And that's both sides of the equation. I can't stress how difficult the challenge of unpaid rent is also hitting us in our current economic environment. Despite a lot of heavy lifting at the state, counties, and affordable housing providers on the rent help front, inability to pay rent remains a key issue for our residents and our organizations, both in terms of impact it will have on pending evictions, but also in its impact on the viability of existing affordable housing. Nearly 20% of our residents remain unable to pay rent, which directly impacts the revenue we desperately need to pay for building staff, services, maintenance. At one time early in the pandemic, PPL was owed nearly $1 million in back rent. Our staff did a fabulous job of working with residents to scramble with rental assistance to keep them in their homes. Since the beginning of the pandemic, our organization has absorbed over $4 million in lost revenue due to unpaid rent. And we anticipate those challenges will continue throughout 2023 and beyond. That's not sustainable. It impacts not only our ability to keep folks housed, but also our ability to produce new affordable housing. I'll wrap up by asking you to not look at housing as just a roof, but as a safe, affordable, and necessary foundation that drives better education outcomes for our kids, creates better long-term health care outcomes, provides a platform for skilled and engaged workforce. It's an investment that has direct returns for Minnesotans. I had the honor last year of co-chairing the Governor's Council on Economic Expansion. We heard these same themes from leaders across the state, time and time again, making the connection between housing and economic growth in particular. Those states that figure this out at scale will prosper. Those that don't will languish. We at PPL support the push for a $2 billion investment in housing that cuts across new production strategies, operating supports, income assistance, and home ownership. Really appreciate you taking the time to hear me. Any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Thanks, Mr. Williams. Next, we have Cecil Smith with the Minnesota Multi-Housing. Oh, sorry. We do have one question. Representative Presbeck.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Joe, I just want to give my thanks for your presentation and also stating the healthcare factor with homelessness on having to see whether you're going to afford your medication determines your housing. So I appreciate your words. Thank you.
Thank you. There we go. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. My name is Cecil Smith. I am the CEO of the Minnesota Multi-Housing Association. We represent 2,200 members in the state of Minnesota with over 305,000 units of rental housing. I wanted to give you a briefing on the state of the industry, which we had a magazine issue that was devoted completely to the state of property management in Minnesota in September, October. And the diagnosis was it's stormy. We are in difficult times. We have some serious headwinds. We have workforce challenges, public safety challenges, eviction delays, property taxes, insurance, inflation, regulations, and undersupply that are all providing serious challenges to the industry. And my colleague, Mr. Williams, outlined some of these. I'm going to dive in a little bit deeper. This gentleman is one of the most prized individuals in our industry right now. He is a maintenance technician, and they are very hard to find, and they do very important work in our industry, keeping homes safe and dignified for our residents, and the timely maintenance and upkeep of our properties. They're very difficult to recruit and retain. We've seen a 20% increase over 2017 to 2021 in compensation for entry-level techs. And this is against the headwinds of record low unemployment in our state. We're also experiencing quiet quitting like other industries. And the desire for hybrid work models. All of these are posing very serious challenges for maintenance and leasing staff. Public safety is a headwind for our industry. Many in our industry never included on their budgets the need for security on an ongoing basis. They would do capital expenditure programs related to cameras and lighting, features that are desirable and useful, But now we have the serious challenge of ongoing public safety challenges at our properties and the necessity to employ security staff to help alleviate some of those challenges. We've seen long-term owners that have sold their portfolios for these very reasons, because this was not the industry that they entered years ago, and it's changed. And we have staff resigning because of the stress and the challenges of the threats that they face as they engage in helping maintain building security. And this is a statewide challenge. It's not just a core metro area challenge. We've got challenges in different parts of the state on public safety. Eviction delays. Following the end of the eviction moratorium and different procedures and practices, we saw the courts have long delays in issuing eviction summons. In August, there was a 4-month delay. That created serious economic challenges for our industry, where we often had people that owed 6 months of rent before we even got to housing court. That obviously has had an impact economically on the industry. Courts are now adding capacity, but we're going to close our books with a lot of bad debt on our books this year. Property taxes. We've seen serious shifts over the years on property taxes, and this chart from Department of Revenue shows that residential non-homestead properties have experienced 13.5% growth in property taxes just in 2021, and over the period of 2016 to 2020, 12%, the largest growth in property taxes has been on apartments. This is also reflected in property tax collections. In 2013, we were collecting approximately $400 million from apartment buildings and property taxes. Now that's crossed over $800 million in 2022. We haven't doubled the size of our housing stock in apartments. There's been a serious property tax shift onto apartment real estate. Insurance. 2021, we do every 2 years we do a operations survey, and the last one was in 2021, and we saw a 15% increase in insurance costs. We have higher replacement costs now, and there's a substantial local claims history with these billion-dollar hailstorms that we have in Minnesota. Those are starting to stabilize, but insurance has provided a lot of economic headwinds for our industry. And then, of course, there's inflation, which all of us are experiencing in our own lives, but we're feeling it through employee compensation, taxes and insurance, as I mentioned, but also utility costs, appliance pricing, materials and parts pricing have all substantially increased. What is this doing? It's leading to trying to find budget relief through deferred maintenance or delaying capital expenditures at our properties. And, you know, a word of warning here, we have a potential crisis coming with interest rates. Unlike single-family homeowners that tend to get 15 to 30-year mortgages with stable interest rates, we often have floating interest rates, or the terms are only 5 years before they refinance. And so we're potentially looking at a very large increase in debt service costs hitting our industry over the next few years, as we've seen the significant rise in interest rates. And that's going to obviously hit renters seriously. Regulations, and not to impugn the capital here, but you know, regulations are a serious cost, whether it's rent control, inclusionary zoning, the recently proposed 5% QAP proposal for a rent cap, on and on, different regulations in different jurisdictions, which requires additional training and different systems and processes cross-jurisdictionally, which gets complicated and expensive. And then our national peers have done a study which shows that 40% of the cost of housing can be attributed to regulation. We have the undersupply problem. I think you're familiar with this chart from Minnesota Housing. And a recent study that was produced by Up for Growth showed that in the metro area we're short 80,000 units of housing, and across the state 94,000 units of housing. That's a serious undersupply that we need to address quickly in our state. With that, I will take questions.
Thank you, Mr. Smith, and I saw that Representative Nash had a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Smith, quick question for you. What does the presence of uncollected rent, bad debt write-offs, many of the other pressures that you have do to your membership's desire or ability to make future investments and build more apartments? Because that is a part of the equation that I talk about. Apartments are homes. They are important parts of the equation. But what does that do to the overall ability for your members to stay in the market or build into market with additional apartment houses?
Mr.
Mr. Chair, Representative Nash, this is a serious challenge because it both, in terms of financing, it changes underwriting standards. So as we gain more experience with the market and the ability to collect the rent roll, underwriting standards adjust. That may mean that there has to be greater capital infusion when a project is being financed by the equity partners or higher interest rates to cover that risk on the part of the debt provider. It also means that budgets have to shift. If you know that instead of a 2, 3, or 5% bad debt cost, that you're now facing a 7, 8, 9, 10% bad debt costs, that adjusts your timing on CapEx, that adjusts your timing on rent or the amount of rent increases. I mean, ultimately, all of these costs, if we're going to continue to cash flow our properties, have to flow to renters. And any alleviation, any ways in which we can control that and mitigate that is helpful. And often, when we're setting rents, we're understanding what the market can bear, and we can't go beyond that. And so we have to adjust budgets elsewhere, whether it's reduced staffing or delaying improvements at the property that might be essential.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Oh, Representative Hussain.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just have a quick question about you won't be able to build any properties because of renter control. Is that, can you explain a little bit more? And because my understanding, the city of St. Paul also have exempt 20 years for tax exempt for you to build kind of affordable housing if you are pursuing.
Mr. Smith.
So I'm just talking about the cost of regulation there. And so rent control is a cost of regulation. You're right, there's a 20-year exemption that just came to force January 1st in St. Paul regarding rent control. But rent control limits the number of investors that are willing to come into a market, and it also, as we're starting to see, reduces the value of an asset. So when you reduce the value of an asset, you dissuade investors from coming into that market. That dissuades investment, dissuades reinvestment in properties. Those are real costs.
Representative Hussain.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Next, we're going to talk some homeownership with the Homeownership Coalition with Jeff Washburn and Kristen in City. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Chair Howard. One moment, please. I'll pull this up.
Well, while he's doing that, thank you, Chair Howard and members of the committee for having us. My name is Kristen in City, and I'm the co-chair of Homeownership Minnesota, which is a statewide coalition of affordable homeownership providers. We practice in the preparation of home buyers, the production of new units, and the preservation of current units, as well as foreclosure prevention counseling. In addition to co-chairing the coalition, I'm also the CEO of Habitat for Humanity of Minnesota, and we're a statewide organization for the 25 Habitat affiliates that serve the state of Minnesota. Habitat for Humanity reaches about 85% of the counties in the state, and they're distinct nonprofits, but we're here to sort of represent their voice. And just for little fact, just last year, the Habitat affiliates in the state of Minnesota produced about 136 brand new Habitat homeowners through affordable homeownership across the state. So.
Thank you for buying time. Chair Howard, committee members, my name is Jeff Washburn. I'm the director for the City of Lakes Community Land Trust, a community land trust that serves the city of Minneapolis. I'm also, with Kristen, the co-chair of the Home Coalition. Home stands for Homeownership Minnesota, and specifically here elevates the role of affordable homeownership as a critical component of solving the statewide affordable housing shortage and as a necessary step toward closing wealth disparities and addressing racial inequities. Additionally, what we're trying to do is play the important role of creating pathways for a growing number of Minnesota households who are working but are still not able to achieve home ownership in the state. And so all of our organizations, which include Habitats, community land trusts, CAP agencies, the Homeownership Center and its practitioners, providers, as well as a number of nonprofit developers make up this coalition. Most of us that play the role in this coalition are also practitioners. Our day jobs are not in the advocacy space by and large, but we are out there trying to create the housing and creating opportunities for low and moderate income residents here of the state. Our membership, as I mentioned, broadly, different organizations. We represent the state. Almost every county in the state is represented by one of our members. Creating land trusts, co-ops, manufactured housing, single-family home ownership. Within that, duplexes, homes with accessory dwelling units, condos also are included in that group, and include experts in home buyer education, production, mortgage lending, foreclosure prevention as well, the full gamut, and really trying to play an important role within that housing continuum that's been mentioned today on several occasions. For every affordable home ownership opportunity we create, we're hopeful that there's ideally an affordable rental home that's opening up for somebody else. So playing that role, bridging the difference between what I think is increasingly more difficult to get into market rate home ownership with a space that is what we call affordable home ownership. So the need, and I think there'll be a couple presenters that will talk a little bit more about this, but we're currently the 5th worst in the nation as it relates to the home ownership disparity between whites and households of color homeowners. A net gain on that mark would move us from 5th worst to 11th worst, which still doesn't sound great, but it's doubling that position of where we're at. And you can see through the numbers behind me, by increasing that number by 50,000 homeowners, we're actually able to get us to a much more favorable position. This time, where we are with the state budget, we truly believe that we have the capacity to make a huge difference on this front. And for over 50 years, we've been really struggling with this disparity. And it feels like now is the time. We have the capacity, we have the ability to start to knock down this disparity that I think our state, unfortunately, has been known for. Here in the state, the median home price is $307,000. For us to create affordable housing, we're typically needing to raise $100,000 to $200,000 to bridge the difference between what a low-income household can get a mortgage for and the cost of that property. To build homes, as been mentioned by other presenters today, it's costly. And I don't believe it's going to get any cheaper. For us to, depending on the market, cost anywhere between $350,000 and $500,000 to build a single-family home today. And if we're truly working to try and serve low-income households, that means that we're needing to put in $175,000 to $250,000 in affordability gap. That's a lot of money, and we realize that. And I think increasingly, a larger portion of the members of our group are part of shared equity home ownership, where not only are we helping one household with that large investment, but we're helping multiple generations of home buyers achieve home ownership and then move on to market rate home ownership. For us to serve households at 60% of median income, arguably and disproportionately households who are also households of color fall below 50 and 60% AMI, we need to talk about the dollars that it's going to take to create those home ownership opportunities. It's a real cost, but I think we're able to demonstrate how not only are we putting a roof over someone's house, but somebody's family, but we're also doing so in a way that creates future opportunities for future generations of buyers. Homeownership is affordable housing. I think for many, they think about home ownership and they don't see that as an affordable housing tool, but we clearly see that, and we also see the benefits. For renters who make less than $50,000 a year, 75% are cost burden, and 30% and they spend 30% of their housing, 30% of their income on housing. 42% are severely cost burdened, and they're spending upwards of 50% of their income on housing. In the U.S., 2/3 of the counties in the United States, it is cheaper for someone to own a home than to rent a home. And I think just in my own experience with my organization, over the life of close to 500 households we've served, on average, households are paying less for their principal, interest, mortgage, and insurance payments than they previously paid in rent by about $15. That's not a huge amount of money, but to be able to get into home ownership, in many cases have a yard, quite a bit more square footage, we see that it's making a huge difference in households' lives. For owners who make less than $50,000 a year, homeowners are paying 10% less on housing than the average renter. And it's also been shown that owners have over 40 times the wealth of renters. I think this is important before Kristen takes over with her comments. What I've seen over time is seeing a lot of first-generation, first-time buyers get into home ownership, and seeing them make that move is something that they never thought they'd be able to do. And that, over time, having conversations with homeowners who've purchased, seeing those households come back after a couple of years, and not just talk about they're being thankful for owning a home, but it's about the stability that they've gained and the confidence they've gained from home ownership that's allowed them to go on and go back to school, start a new job, and be more invested in community.
Jeff did a really nice job transitioning to the next slide, which is really about the impacts of affordable homeownership that we statistically studied through the Habitat Network in 2015, and the City of Lakes Community Land Trust released a report in 2021. So I'm not going to review all of that data, but to just highlight that just like the other speakers you've heard today around the supply challenges and creating more access to affordable housing, the same story is true in the homeownership space. The fair market value that Jeff noted earlier is inaccessible to low and moderate income households without the support of a Habitat or a land trust or another affordable homeownership provider. And so as the committee is looking at investments today and throughout the legislative session, supply creation and preservation of the aging housing stock around the state continues to be a common theme for the affordable homeownership space as well. And as Jeff noted, in the impacts in that study, the Urban Institute led that study. And so you have a handout of an infographic that our team made on that. When we think about the racial gaps in our state, one of them is the wealth gap between white households and black households. And the critical reason for that existing is because of homeownership tenure. And so when we look at that stat of 40 times the amount of wealth for renters versus homeowners, solving the wealth gap and the racial gap in homeownership are linked. It's critical. So investing in affordable homeownership is a really important thing that we need to do as a state. And you can review some of these great stats. One of our favorites is 90% of Habitat homeowners said they feel better about their children's future since buying a home. One that I'll note from the Land Trust study was 87% of current City of Lakes Community Land Trust homeowners report they have a better quality of life since becoming land trust homeowners. So we feel really proud about that data. And I just sort of jumped into this just on the solutions. You know, what we're thinking about and what we're really striving for with Homeownership Minnesota and Habitat is to increase the production around the state from an average of 100 units annual. That's what the state is providing right now. About 100 to 150 units are produced with current Minnesota housing funding levels to get to closer to 500 per year with state investment. It's a big leap, and we're ready to approach that challenge. We also know that we need to create new and different financing tools that reach BIPOC and low and moderate income households. So today we have these racial disparities in homeownership for a number of reasons, and one of them is access to credit. And so we need to create new tools and resources for that, including an access to down payment assistance and investing in the network's capacity and infrastructure. So on the last slide, just some really great stats for you around why this matters for the whole housing continuum. We all work really well together when we invest in a fully functioning housing continuum. And this first stat here, Minnesota Housing Research identified 27,000 households occupying the state's most affordable rental units are income qualified for homeownership, but continue to rent because there isn't access to those units due to supply and credit barriers. So if we invest in affordable homeownership, we're also investing in the rest of the continuum as well. So with that, we are happy to take questions.
Thank you very much for joining us. Up next, we have Paul Egger from the Minnesota Realtors. Mr. Egger, welcome.
Mr. Chair, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Paul Egger. I'm Senior Vice President of Governmental Affairs for the Minnesota Realtors Association. Briefly, for new members of the legislature who may not be familiar with our organization.
Sorry, Mr. Egger, could you speak a little closer to the mic?
Sure.
Thank you.
Minnesota Realtors is a statewide business trade association with about 22,000 members working with buyers and sellers every day. Our members are also licensed by the Minnesota Department of Commerce. Minnesota Realtors, our association, provides a variety of services to our members. And we also put out monthly housing market reports and a year-end annual housing report, which includes key housing market metrics. I'll be referencing some of that data today in my comments. In addition to the data in our market reports, our members see the challenges with home ownership because they are working with their buyer and seller clients every day, helping them navigate the complexities of the real estate transaction, which for most of us is the largest and most expensive purchase of our life. Today, I want to highlight 3 challenges that we see that exist in the home ownership area. Certainly not all the challenges, but 3 that we think are important to highlight. I want to start with interest rates, which are top of mind for, I think, everybody right now. In 2020 and 2021, those years were characterized by exceptionally low interest rates, between 2.75 and 3.6%. That contributed to a highly active housing market, and highly active, euphemism for very competitive, characterized by multiple offers and homes selling very quickly. However, beginning last spring, when the Federal Reserve began raising interest rates, mortgage rates crept up over 5%, and by September, rates had surpassed 6%. Higher interest rates have definitely impacted the market. Data from the Minnesota Realtors December market report, which was just released today, after I had drafted my testimony, so I had to take some time to plug in some new numbers, Mr. Chair, show that in December, closed sales fell almost 39% compared to December of 2021. That marks 12 straight months of declines. Closed sales were also down almost 18% in calendar year 2022 compared to 2021. High interest rates are impacting some consumers' ability to purchase a home, especially first-time home buyers. While competition in the market is not as intense as it was over the past couple of years, we have not seen a reduction in home prices, which leads us to the next challenge. Minnesota needs more housing units for purchase, particularly at the most affordable price points, $300,000 and below. Minnesota Realtors tracks 2 housing supply metrics: months supply of inventory, which is the inventory of homes for sale at the end of a given month, divided by the average monthly pending sales from the last 12 months, and inventory of homes for sale, which is the number of properties available for sale in the inactive status at the end of a given month. 4 to 6 months supply of inventory is necessary for the market to be well balanced between buyers and sellers. In December, month supply of inventory was up 50% compared to December 2021, which is positive. However, that meant an increase from 1 month's supply to 1.5 months supply, well below that 4 to 6 months of supply that represents a balanced market. I look back at some historical data, and it appears the last time Minnesota even reached 4 months' supply of inventory, which is the low-end mark of a balanced market, it was June of 2016. There were 9,204 homes available for sale in December, which was up 15% from December 2021. But for context, if we look back to January of 2019, there were around 14,700 homes for sale. And if we look back 10 years to January of 2013, there are almost 36,000 homes for sale. When buyers have to compete for scarce inventory, the laws of supply and demand mean prices go up and remain elevated. Minnesota needs to build more housing, and the legislature should bring together stakeholders, that means cities, builders, and others, to discuss policy options that will result in the construction of more housing of all types by the private sector to help better meet current and future demand. The last challenge, which is also an opportunity that I want to highlight, is the importance of increasing access to sustainable home ownership and reducing Minnesota's racial home ownership gap, which the previous testifiers also touched on. Others have addressed Minnesota's wide and persistent home ownership gap over the past couple of hearings, which is one of the largest in the country. Not surprisingly, one of the most significant barriers to home ownership is lack of resources for a down payment. In 2020, Minnesota Realtors and the Minnesota Homeownership Center partnered on a down payment assistance research project. Our partnership led to a proposal last session by a large and diverse group of stakeholders led by the Minnesota Homeownership Center, Twin Cities Habitat for Humanity, and Minnesota Realtors to create a new first-generation homebuyers down payment assistance fund. Vice Chair Agbaje was the author of that bill in the House, and Senator Draheim carried it in the Senate. Our coalition continued to meet over the interim and brought forward an updated first-generation homebuyers down payment assistance fund proposal this session. The intent of this proposal, as you heard from a previous testifier, is to support at least 5,000 first-generation homebuyers with down payment assistance over the next 3 years and move Minnesota out of the top 10 states with the largest disparity gaps. I just want to thank Vice Chair Agbaje again for authoring the bill this year. It has already been introduced as House File 12, and we look forward to your consideration of that bill in the committee at some point this session. Mr. Chair, that concludes my presentation, and thank you again for the opportunity to testify today.
Thank you, Mr. Egger. And last, but certainly not least, we have Joel Hansen with the Northcountry Cooperative Foundation. And before we go, we do have one, Julie Guggen with the Homeownership Center. So we will go a little bit long, two days in a row here, but we'll get there. Mr. Hansen.
All right, Chair Howard, members of the committee, thank you very much for being here. I'm trying to pull up my presentation here on this computer. And I don't see it coming up on the screen. Yep.
Perhaps Mr. Hansen's used to Senate technology.
Well, I was going to say, Chair Howard, this is my 8th day with NC. Oh, sorry. This is my 8th day with NCF, so naturally I know everything there is to know about this as well as technology here. But okay, so there might be a chance that Ms. Guggen could go, and then she said she has to call her supervisor to try to get this to display. Otherwise, if you want me to testify now, I'm more than happy to.
And I think we may have information in our packets. Is that right? Or no, it's on the. Oh, it's on the flash drive. Okay.
Okay.
Sure. Let's have Ms. Guggen go. We can kind of switch the order. Thank you.
Appreciate the audible.
Yep. Welcome to the committee.
Chair Howard, members of the committee, my name is Julie Guggen. I'm the president of the nonprofit Minnesota Homeownership Center. Owning a home is the foundation for family and community success. Homeownership grounds families. Children of homeowners do better in school. Owning a home leads to stable employment and better health. And successful homeownership builds wealth. In fact, the median net worth of homeowners in this country is more than 44 times that of renters. Toward that end, the Minnesota Homeownership Center offers education and advisory services and other resources to help with buying a home, and one-on-one assistance to prevent foreclosure when times are tough. We focus our programming and outreach towards those who have traditionally been left out of the homeownership space. We and our partners are laser focused on working with households of color. Last year, upwards of 70% of the households we served represented communities of color, and the median income of households served was just over $43,000. Of the more than 4,300 households we served last year, approximately 70% were in the metro area and 30% were in greater Minnesota. For nearly 30 years, we have worked to educate potential homebuyers on the complicated process of qualifying for a mortgage, affording down payment and closing costs, and transitioning to sustainable homeownership. We carry out this work by partnering with more than 30 community-based organizations around the state. In a survey conducted on behalf of the center just before the pandemic, more than half of non-owner respondents indicated that they plan to buy a home within the next 5 years. But the uneven impact of COVID, rising home values and interest rates, and constrained inventory have created unprecedented barriers to the achievement of this aspiration, especially for those we work with. Coupled with historic racism and lingering systemic bias, we in Minnesota find ourselves living with one of the highest racial homeownership gaps in the country. The gap between white and black households is nearly 50%. This is not acceptable. We actively lead and convene a range of initiatives leading real estate, lending, government, and nonprofits designed to transform the traditional home buying system to ensure equitable access for all. For our legislative efforts, we partner with Twin Cities Habitat for Humanity. Both of our organizations are active members of the Home Coalition and are actively supportive of the agenda that Kristen and Jeff talked about today. We are intent on reversing homeownership injustice and averting the threats posed by homeownership challenges to individual households, our communities, and our collective economy. We are also, as you heard from Paul Egger, we are also, once again this year, actively engaged, working hand in hand with the Minnesota Association of Realtors on a legislative proposal. It is in this spirit I'm here today to speak on behalf of the Center and Twin Cities Habitat in support of increased funding for homeownership education, counseling, and training, or HECAT, so that we can expand our network services and reach even more of the aspiring homebuyers facing the greatest barriers to homeownership. We also seek support for House File 12, our joint legislative proposal with Twin Cities Habitat and the Minnesota Realtors, which would establish a first-generation homebuyer assistance fund. Vice Chair Agbaje is the House author for this bill, as we've already learned. If enacted, we would be able to move 5,000 renter households into homeownership with meaningful down payment assistance. The days of $5,000, $10,000, or even $15,000 of down payment assistance for lower to moderate income homeowners helping to achieve homeownership are gone. We need significantly more dollars than we've seen in the past. The combination of homebuyer education and down payment assistance is frequently cited as the dominant solution for addressing the racial homeownership gap. Thank you all for your attention. Look forward to partnering with you throughout this session.
Thank you, Ms. Guggen. And we'll give one more shot to Mr. Hansen here.
Well, in the meantime here, I think I'm just going to get started, if that's all right. But so like I said, my name is Joel Hansen. I'm the Communications and Advocacy Manager with Northcountry Foundation, Cooperative Foundation. Who are we? We're a nonprofit here in the state of Minnesota, founded in 1999, that works in the manufactured housing sector, specifically in cooperative ownership, resident-owned communities. So core services for us, we provide technical assistance, development services to new and existing cooperatives, and specialize, obviously, in housing cooperatives. Perfect. Thank you very much. We have local and national partners here, the Homeownership Coalition, which you've already heard from, Rock USA, Resident-Owned Communities USA, and then the Cooperative Network here in Minnesota and Wisconsin. So try to make this quick as we're already over time, but manufactured housing does represent Minnesota's most affordable ownership opportunity here. We have 45,000 total manufactured units across the state, 180,000 residents. One of the misconceptions about manufactured housing is that individuals who live in manufactured homes don't actually own those homes. 87% of those residents do. They just don't own the land underneath those homes. And cost of preservation is substantially less than other types of housing, anywhere between $10,000 to $50,000 per unit. Okay, so who's served by this? Well, 65% in greater Minnesota. Low income, 75% of residents in manufactured housing is 60% of AMI or less. A third of households are considered extremely low income at 30% of AMI or below. Disproportionately, we serve households of color. Metro demographics are consistent with our experience with co-op conversion. We work all across the state. 40% of the households served through our co-op conversion are households of color. And we serve high populations of Latinx and Southeast Asian households. Also, it represents workforce housing. An example of a co-op that we're doing conversion on now in Gaylord, Minnesota, almost exclusively those individuals work at Michael's Foods, food processing plant, 100% Spanish speaking. So manufactured housing community, as I already kind of touched on. So typical manufactured housing community, investor owns the land beneath the home. There are, the residents pay rent to the investor or the owner, and they will see possible rent increases. Manufactured housing cooperative. So the residents own the park itself. They operate it at cost. The rent increases are only voted on by the members themselves. A corollary might be like a homeowners association, where the residents actually have ownership over the community. They're reinvesting into their own homes. Track record. So we have 13 cooperatives across the state, Minnesota and Wisconsin. And so background kind of on manufactured housing. So the infrastructure is privately owned. It is not municipal owned. The aging infrastructure that we face, a lot of these systems were built in the 50s and the 60s. It represents a gigantic cost for homeowners, investors to try to replace these systems. And when we're talking about infrastructure, I want to be very clear. We're talking about roads, lighting, wastewater, stormwater. It's the whole gamut. So what we've seen recently is that a lot of manufactured home communities are being sold to out-of-state buyers. As you can see here, it's increased most recently. Obviously, in that case, when you have residents that are in those communities and there's out-of-state buyers, there's maybe oftentimes a little disconnect between what the needs of the community are and the owners. So cooperative response. So what do we try to do? Well, we try to permanently preserve this as housing. That's first and foremost stabilizing rent and then reinvesting in the infrastructure. So this can be serving as an affordable housing product into the future, into perpetuity. One of the things, 2.2% per year lot rent increases in rocks, which is much less than what the industry standard is of 5 to 6%. There's also $4.3 million worth of capital expenditures that are in the process in our resident-owned communities, with another $5 million in the pipeline. So legislative wins. The legislature here has been incredibly supportive of manufactured housing. So in 2017, we established a bipartisan bicameral working group We have a manufactured housing infrastructure fund that was established in 2017 that has since been expanded. Workforce and affordable housing fund as well. In 2021, we had manufactured housing titling reform that a lot of you were involved in. One of the neat stories out of that is we reformed manufactured housing titling in resident-owned communities to be real property, not chattel property or personal property. What that means is theoretically could be eligible for a mortgage. Recently, Fannie Mae has expressed interest in coming into the state to offer manufactured housing financing for resident-owned communities, and is actually partnering with NCF on a project in southern Minnesota, which would be a new park, and they're helping us in that because they see this as being a model moving forward. In addition, in 2021, there was $15 million set aside in housing infrastructure bonds for manufactured housing. This last year, there was $10 million in the manufactured housing infrastructure program. $6 million were awarded to resident-owned communities, $4 million to privately owned parks, all going to help preserve manufactured housing and affordable home ownership. So we're already over time. I'll be very brief and conclude that. I'll stand for any questions, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Hansen, and thank you to all of our testifiers for, again, we went through so much in just one hearing, and we could spend a hearing with each of you in your, and we probably will, as we have legislative proposals going forward on the whole continuum of housing. And with that, members, we are adjourned.